Okay, we might get the proceedings underway. I hope you can all hear me. We are working in hybrid mode again tonight, and this is a really wonderful and somewhat experimental large gathering as we emerge out of our COVID year. But yeah, it's really wonderful that everybody has been able to come along tonight, not only here in person, but currently we have about 80 people online. I think that will grow a little bit as well. We've had some 300 people register for this event, so really wonderful to welcome you all here. My name's Simon Haberle, and I'm the director of the School of Culture, History and Language, and that's the school that is sponsoring the Golson lecture, and as we have done for many years, a really wonderful event that honours Jack's contribution to prehistory, archaeology, and the work that we all engage with and are familiar with in this Pacific and Australian region. So yeah, really wonderful that Jack has been able to make it here tonight, and welcome, Jack. And hopefully everybody gets an opportunity to say hello at some point, but yeah, it's a real honour and pleasure to have you here for this event. Just a few housekeeping things. We've got drinks afterwards, and I'd really like to thank Steph and May, who are out the front helping to register you, and with Shimona and some others. We've put a lot of effort into organising this, so please follow instructions if you can, and I know you've all registered and so on with the QR code, so that's important to do in these days. Also like to thank Stuart Bedford, who I believe might be online, from Vanuatu, and he's played a big role in organising this event as well. So thanks to Stuart for doing that. Yeah, really, it's a great pleasure to be here as part of the school, as I mentioned, and we've had a long, obviously, association with Jack, and many of you here have been at CHL. So yeah, really excellent to be able to actually hold this event tonight. Really, my only other job is to introduce Peter Bellwood, who is going to actually introduce our main speaker tonight. But Peter also is, I'm sure, well known to many of you. Yeah, Peter will give a short sort of introduction to Matthew. But before we do that, I'd just also like to pay acknowledgement and give acknowledgement to the traditional owners who on whose land we meet. This Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, custodians of this land that was never ceded, and we pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. So with that note, I'd like to pass it on to Peter Bellwood to say a few words.
Thank you, Simon. Well, welcome everyone to this new world of combined seminars and Zoominars. Sorry. Possibly in the future, we might see it as one of the very few things that we actually have to thank COVID for when it's gone and disappeared. This lecture is, of course, to honour Jack Golson, who was the founder of Prehistory in what was at that time the Research School of Pacific Studies. Jack, and then of course with John Mulvaney as well, are the two founders in this university of the study of archaeology. And Jack was also Matthew's PhD supervisor. So Jack has a very important role in all of this, and I'm very pleased to say that Jack is here tonight, sitting in front of me down here. The main star of the night, though, is Matthew Spriggs, who will be giving his talk on Has the Origin of Pacific Peoples Now Been Solved? I'll let Matthew answer that one. But first of all, a few words about Matthew himself. I first met him in 1976, a long time ago now. I thought I was perhaps the oldest meeting person, I suppose, in ANU. Or at least the first person in Australia to meet him. But Matthew tells me that he met with Jack before he met with me. He finished his BA honours degree. He was at St John's College, finished his BA in 1976 with first-class honours. He studied the archaeology of Asia, particularly India, Southeast Asia, China. And in 1975, he went with Danny Miller, a material culture anthropologist at now at University College London, and they went to Indonesia and did some reconnaissance work in the southern Moluccas Islands. In 1977, he came to ANU with a scholarship to study a PhD in archaeology. Jack Golson and Jim Allen were his supervisors, and Jim Allen is also here tonight. Also around in ANU at that time was Les Grube, who I understand from reading the preface to his PhD suggested that Matthew go to Aneityum Island in the southern, what were then the southern New Hebrides, now southern Vanuatu, to study the cultivation of taro in prehistory. And that led to his PhD, Vegetable Kingdoms, Taro Irrigation and Pacific Prehistory in 1981. At the same time, Matthew was developing an interest in Marxist approaches to archaeology, and he did publish an edited book on this with Cambridge University Press in 1984. Although I have to say, I bet when he went to the Moluccas, he didn't discuss Marxism with the immigration officials in Jakarta airport. That was a very difficult time in Indonesia. I was there myself in 1974, and my Indonesian colleague spent 3 years in prison for being a member of the Communist Party. So it wasn't Indonesia was not a very happy place in the mid-1970s. In 1981, Matthew was appointed to a faculty position at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in Honolulu, and he taught there until 1987 and did quite a lot of research in Hawaiian archaeology. In 1987, he was appointed here as a fellow in prehistory in the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies with Jack Golson, and he came to the School of Archaeology and Anthropology, or Archaeology and Anthropology Department as it was then, in 1997 as a professor, and he's been here since then. That is in what is now the School of Archaeology and Anthropology, except for 3 years on a 50-50 combined appointment that he and I shared between the two departments. That was in 2002 to 2004. Matthew is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in London and of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. But Matthew's main achievement, I suppose, in terms of sterling things, was getting a laureate fellowship in 2015, 1 year after Sue O'Connor, who is also here in the audience. And Matthew set up his current project, the collective biography of archaeology in the Pacific. That brought many people to ANU. There have been many conferences. There was going to be one last year to wrap up this project, but of course it was put off because of COVID, but it's going to be held, I understand, later this year. For me, Matthew's main research contributions have been in, well, the Peter I would probably put first, Island, Southeast Asia. He wrote a great deal in the 1990s about chronometric hygiene and was one of the founding figures in the current knowledge that Eastern Polynesia was not settled as long ago as people used to think. In the days of Robert Suggs and Kenneth Emery, it was thought to be 200 BC. Now, of course, it's got shorter and shorter in time and come towards AD 1000 or even 1200 in the case of New Zealand. Matthew also has a book with Blackwell, The Island Melanesians, that has been very influential. That was published in 1997. And he lists as his research interests Pacific and Southeast Asian archaeology, politics and archaeology, hence the Marxism, I guess, history of Pacific and Southeast Asian archaeology, archaeology and linguistics, that we're going to hear something about today, subsistence systems and agricultural origins. This, of course, comes from his PhD work, human-environment interactions, and there is one more, which you'll never guess unless you know Matthew very well, and it's Cornish studies. Matthew has some Cornish heritage, and he's very interested in Edward Louis, I think was Cornish, right? One of the great antiquarians of 17th century England. And I've seen Matthew's name on matters to do with Edward Louis. Oh, there is one thing missing from this list, of course, in terms of what Matthew is going to be talking about today, and that is archaeology and ancient DNA. Yes, you have to put it in your list, Matthew, I think. Matthew's talk today is a topic of great interest to me. I've always been a firm believer in the idea that geneticists, linguists, and archaeologists should talk to each other and not try and write as though the other side doesn't exist. And Matthew has been a strong supporter in this. I suspect we don't agree on everything. I think we might agree on probably most things to do with the settlement of the Pacific, but I'm sure there are a few obscure corners that will pop up from time to time where there are some differences. I mean, Matthew, to me, looking back at Matthew's career, because he is about to retire, I've always been impressed by Matthew's enthusiasm. I used to see that in faculty meetings and things like that. Matthew was always very good at getting things moving and always had lots of good ideas. He's had a sterling career in terms of getting grants and putting out research material, publications. And I wish him well in his retirement, but before he does retire, I'm sure he's going to give us his lecture tonight, which has the question of the origin of Pacific peoples now being solved, Lapita ancient DNA, and Eastern Polynesian linguistic origins. So I'd like to call on Matthew to come and give his Golson lecture for 2021.
Thank you very much, Peter. I realise there were actually a couple of people I met before you and Jack. One was is in the room, is Jim Allen, who I also met during the early 70s. But the earliest of the Canberra associated people I met was my teacher in the first year, which was the late, great Colin Groves, who taught biological anthropology my first year at Cambridge just before he shifted and came over here. Okay, right, we should get this going. Oh, let's get it going that way. How do I make it go forward? It's that way. Okay, someone will doubtless come and tell me. No? Okay, right. Okay, right. Oh, it's that one. Okay, now we've got it sorted out now. Okay, excellent. Please note, first of all, I'm not a geneticist. And I'm merely an archaeologist who works with geneticists. I've been very privileged to work with David Reich's lab at the Harvard Medical School since about 2015. And so when geneticists talk about things like single nucleotide polymorphisms and explain it slowly and clearly to me in a loud voice, I do feel that I understand what they're talking about. 5 minutes later, I've completely forgotten it. So if I make any terrible genetic mistakes, please, any geneticists in the audience, forgive me. What my talk is really about is the reaction of an archaeologist to the major revolution in whole genome genetics. The human genome was first sequenced in, when was it, sort of 2004 or something. But the first ancient human genomes were sequenced in 2010, and notably the draft Neanderthal genome and the draft Denisovan genome, notoriously taken from DNA from a pinky. And I think to this day, we've never actually seen the face of the Denisovan, but we know a lot about their genetics. Things sped up very quickly after 2010. And although this wasn't in the article by Rasmus Nielsen et al., I would also claim that in 2016, one of the major advances in ancient DNA occurred when from our Teuma Lapita cemetery site in Vanuatu, full genome coverage, whole genome coverage, ancient DNA was achieved, which was the first time in the tropical world that anyone had ever been able to do it. The secret was the petrous bone, which is kind of under your ear here, which, as its name suggests, stone bone is the densest bone in the human body. And although it was extremely difficult to find ancient DNA in teeth or ribs, they used to try back in the old days, it's hiding there in the petrous bone in some cases. But still, you have to examine a lot of samples before you can get good coverage. Also, there were major advances in just the capture of ancient DNA and the way that people were able to sort out the real DNA from contamination. Illustrating this even more, this is shows the rise in the number of publications on ancient genomes up to 2019, and you will note that 2019 is not actually a decrease from 2018. That is merely the publications for the first 6 months of the year. So the amount of material that is coming out all over the world on ancient human genomes, obviously a lot of work in Europe, is very hard to keep up with, and it certainly raises many questions for archaeologists. And I think many archaeologists, including sometimes myself, are actually in a sort of state of shock at what's going on and the new results that are coming through. I'm going to really try and have a look at 4 episodes of human migration, colonization in Oceania. First of all, and very briefly, how modern humans got to Sahul, or the date that they got in perhaps, and onto the Bismarcks and Solomons and their genetic links. Secondly, I'll look at the expansion of Yangtze River rice farmers into Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago. Then one of the major discoveries that came from our Tauma work, the Papuan migration from New Britain to Vanuatu and onwards from 2,700 or so years on. And finally, the settlement of Eastern Polynesia via the central northern Polynesian outliers just off the Solomons, and not, as in every textbook, from Samoa between about 1.2 to 1,200 to 700 years ago. And then finally, I posed the question whether now it's all been solved and we can all go home, happy and glad. The lines of evidence, I remember, must have been in the 1980s, that the Pacific linguist, Andy Pawley, said, "We linguists are 50 years ahead of you archaeologists in sorting out the history of the Pacific." And I thought, what an arrogant thing to say. But in fact, he was kind of right, because at least since the days of Otto Dempwolf in the 1930s, some would argue for a long time before, linguists at least had a framework to interpret the deep time history of the Pacific based on historical linguistics. Archaeologists did not really have a clear framework, I would say, in having a good knowledge of most of the Pacific until the 70s, 80s, for Micronesia, I would think even the 90s. So in that sense, I kind of now recognize many years later, having thought how arrogant these linguists are, that there was something in it. Now, if you want arrogance, you can see the quotation, which is actually from me, written around 2014, just before I started working with linguists. But my point was that of the 3 disciplines, archaeology had kind of got a framework for understanding the Pacific. Geneticists did not have a framework. Based entirely on modern DNA from living people, it was a case for many years that a paper would come out. They all came from Taiwan. Next paper would come out saying, they don't come from Taiwan. Next paper would come out. They all come from Taiwan. And it's clearly the mark of an immature discipline. An immature discipline, not in its techniques, but in its interpretive frameworks. And I think that has, some people would argue, that has remained a problem with the way that ancient DNA has worked. But my feeling for the Pacific is that we have moved on from a situation where every new genetics paper disagreed with the previous one, and clear patterns are emerging from every new ancient DNA paper, at least, which give me great cause for a belief that they've kind of caught up. with the linguists and then the archaeologists. And there are various other archaeological science lines which are also contributing very much to our understanding of the Pacific as well. If we go to the first topic, people arriving in our region, I think that the sort of, in a way, a standard view, in this case not based on ancient DNA, but on the DNA of viruses, the distinct hepatitis B virus lineages found in Australia and Melanesia, produces a picture that suggests a settlement of Australia, a separate settlement perhaps along the northern boundaries of New Guinea by obviously related groups, and then a spread out in that area. And a very similar picture was put forward by the Nicole Pedro and the team there, based on complete mitochondrial genomes, again of living people. However, we were not alone. So the picture is somewhat more complex than it appeared certainly before 2010, in that all modern humans, certainly outside of Africa, have some admixture with other hominid species, Neanderthals, and then now the famous pinky-wielding Denisovans found in Asia. And it's interesting that if we look at the last 500,000 years, which is during the period of time in which modern humans really evolved and appeared, there were a lot of other relatives of ours out there. And of course, the famous one that you'll remember is Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, as it was unfortunately called. And most recently, and involving in part some of our colleagues at the ANU, Homo luzonensis from Luzon in the Philippines. So there were other people around with which to mix and match. And I said the picture is more complicated. I hope it doesn't get too complicated by this. We can see that Neanderthals had some mixture with modern humans, and that can be seen in the genes of people in the Pacific region. Also, the enigmatic Denisovans had a hand in this. First of all, the idea was that Denisova cave is in Siberia. However, it was found that the greatest amount of in modern genomes of Denisovan genes is actually in Australia and the New Guinea Pacific region. And this led to the suggestion that there must be some southern Denisovans, and indeed genetically it now appears there's more than one kind of southern Denisovan interbreeding with people somewhere in the general region of Southeast Asia and into the Pacific. Also, we return the favour at least to the Neanderthals, who display some mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages which derive from modern humans. And at one remove, we also have doubtless a few genes that have come in from super archaic human types that got, first of all, into the Denisovans, perhaps into the Neanderthals, and then doubtless have got into us in some form as well. As I said, this part of the world is where, among living people, the greatest percentages of Denisovan genes are found. And you'll note here that Eastern Indonesia and into near Oceania, New Guinea, and the Bismarcks here have the size of the circles as sort of relates to the amount of Denisovan, also Neanderthal genes. And recall that, you know, this is from a paper of 2019. You know, no one had ever heard of any Denisovans because we didn't know they existed till 2010. Neanderthals we had known about for some time. It was only in 2011 that the particular association of Denisovan genes with people in this general part of the world came out. And then this report from Jacobs and others, whole genome coverage of 161 new modern genomes from 14 island groups in Island, Southeast Asia and New Guinea, which are then compared to many published sources. And this is generally what happens. We have very few ancient genomes, but the power of them to tell us something about the ancestry of people today is that the same kind of genes are in modern people, and we can compare the two. So you can get a long way with one ancient genome and a lot of modern ones. Papuan admixture, and by Papuans, we really mean the people who originally arrived in the New Guinea, Northern Sahel region, perhaps 50, 60,000 years ago. A lot of argument about that, as I know, and who perhaps, if you think modern day Papua New Guinea or New Guinea Highlanders would be an example of a population with not a great deal of mixture with later incoming people. So Papuan simply means that it's more than a geographical term, but it's not a specific population in some ways. Now, what we see from this study by Jacobs et al. Is that there are two episodes of Denisovan, or two different Denisovan populations, which have spread Denisovan genes into the Pacific. And if you see there, the suggestion is D1, a signal of interbreeding with modern humans in this region. And the dates they're giving, which are based on genetic clocks, which have many problems with them, but a rough ballpark figure is all I would say on that. 30,000 years ago, Denisovan 2 lineage, perhaps 46,000 years ago. So this is a complication to a simple line of modern humans coming into our region. And there's also something very, let's go back. There's something very funny about some aspects of this, which I will get to at the end of the talk. Okay, that's all I have to say on this, the first movement of modern humans, of course, originally out of Africa into our region. The next topic is how we get a whole bunch of genes from East Asian rice farmers out into the Pacific. And the obvious vehicle that the linguists cottoned onto many years ago is that the Austronesian languages, which are spoken across the Pacific and indeed to the other direction towards Madagascar, originating in Taiwan, given that that's where most of the complexity of language groups, Austronesian language groups exists, a vast spread across the world. But as you can see, avoiding Australia entirely and largely avoiding New Guinea, perhaps because by the time of the spread of Austronesian languages, agriculture had been developed in New Guinea. And of course, the great work that Jack and other colleagues of his very early on, like Jim Allen, did in establishing the antiquity and independent nature of the development of agriculture in New Guinea perhaps gives us the clue as to that avoidance pattern there and the spread out as far as Easter Island, New Zealand and Hawaii. Now, the manifestation culturally of this in the western part of the Pacific, which is the most obvious one, and which I think works extremely well, is a correlation between the spread of these Austronesian languages and the Lapita culture about 3,000 years ago, spreading out from a sort of proximate homeland in the Bismarck Archipelago out as far as Samoa, Tonga, Wallis and Futuna, and bridging the gap between near and remote Oceania. Near Oceania is basically the area that people could have reached 50, 60,000 years ago without too much difficulty, given their modes of maritime transport they had then. Beyond that, we see there Santa Cruz, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Fiji, and then the entirety of Polynesia. There's no evidence that anyone got out there before Lapita. In fact, there's a lot of good evidence that nobody did get out there before the Lapita culture 3,000 years ago. Also, and Jack Golson, I believe, was perhaps the first to point this out, the spread of Lapita spoils the firm division that grew up after Dumont d'Urville first put it together in the 1830s between Melanesia and Polynesia, because the Lapita culture ignores that boundary, which always seemed to be a very set one. Okay, Lapita pots, the Teuma site in Vanuatu, discovered in 2004. We excavated it between 2004 and 2010. Very nice, complete pots and completely reconstructible pots, but perhaps most notable because it is a large, comparatively early Lapita cemetery with about 100 individuals. And many of the, in fact, all of the individuals were buried, or they have been found without their heads, and the heads were removed as part of burial practices. So they had their heads when they were originally laid in the ground. Heads were all later removed. Some heads were placed on the chest of others. Some were placed between their legs, as you can see in these examples. So although we have 100 skeletons, we only have about 8 skulls. Luckily, we've been able to extract DNA from, I think, all of them. But the heads have obviously been removed as part of burial practices over an extended period of time and placed somewhere else. Now, in 2016, we published, as I said, the first ancient DNA, whole genome ancient DNA from anywhere in the tropical world. And the major result was that, as you can see in the diagram there, that these 3,000-year-old Lapita burials from Vanuatu, and we had 3 at the time and 1 from Tonga, which people often forget. We also had a Tongan example, very close to East Asians genetically, and quite a long way away from, say, New Guinea Highlanders would be down here. So this was a fairly major result because the general view was that, yes, East Asians had indeed brought pottery and other things into at least the Bismarck archipelago. Suggestion was that there they mixed with the Papuan inhabitants of the region who'd lived there for many thousands of years, tens of thousands of years indeed. And then that mixed population spread out to places such as Vanuatu. All we needed was one skull to say, well, that can't be true because we have essentially unadmixed East Asian populations in Vanuatu with 3,000 years ago, no evidence of any substantial admixture with Papuan populations of the Bismarcks or anywhere else. So basically, we have an East Asian population in Vanuatu 3,000 years ago. So this caused rather a lot of discussion. Also, by comparing the Lapita DNA with modern-day Polynesians and other groups across Melanesia, we could see that Polynesians are not the Lapita people. Lapita people are straight East Asians. Often it's claimed that Polynesians are a sort of branch of this migration, perhaps from the Bismarcks. They perhaps didn't stay as long, or they kept themselves apart from local people, went out to Polynesia and they became the Polynesians. That's absolutely not what happened. All Polynesians are an admixed group between East Asians and Papuans. It's as simple as that. And there's no way of getting around that and sort of claiming that they somehow represent the East Asian population of Lapita. One can see there's actually a kind of climb, really, in terms of ancestry proportions between Papuan and East Asian across the Pacific. So Polynesians have more of the East Asian genes and less of the Papuan genes. People in places like Vanuatu are sort of the opposite. They have more of the Papuan genes and less of the East Asian genes. So that was the picture that we had in 2016. By 2018, again, further samples, and also on another project, the Ancient DNA Lab of Johannes Krause in Jena in Germany came up with these 2 papers looking at Vanuatu again. Vanuatu really is the sort of center of the Pacific world for ancient DNA, in terms of the number of samples, most certainly. And sampling different areas, the project I was involved in with Mark Lipson and others, really our samples came from Mefate and Epi Island, whereas the samples of the Jena team, which involved Stuart Bedford, Frederick Vanuatu, people are also involved with our Harvard team. This was very largely based on samples from Malekula, from Lapita and post-Lapita context, and also Futuna and Tanna. Basically, the patterns, again, look very similar. And between the two papers, we also were able to show that around 2,500 to 2,300 years ago, there were people in Vanuatu who were essentially unadmixed, not East Asians, but unadmixed Papuans. And we're also able to establish, first of all, the ANU team, and then with more samples our own, that the closest living people to these Papuans, who are there by 2,500, are people of the island of New Britain. They're not people from the Solomons. One can distinguish in terms of their genetic background, Solomon Islands, Papuan genes from New Ireland, from New Britain, and from mainland New Guinea. So we're pretty confident that these are people very directly coming from New Britain, and they are following on the heels, as it were, of these East Asian early Lapita people. They are similarly jumping over the top of the Solomons, leapfrogging the Solomons, and not initially having any contact with them. So they're coming into Vanuatu pretty directly. And this, to me, certainly suggests that this is the sort of tail end of Lapita. The boats are still coming, the Lapita pots are still moving around, but the people on the boats are looking somewhat different over time. There are some changes at the end of Lapita, and particularly the Post et al. Team picked up on some of these. There are some quite specific parallels between ethnographically recorded cultural practices on the island of New Britain and Vanuatu. And to me, the most persuasive one is the technologies involved in producing full circle tusker pigs by knocking out their upper canines, and then the teeth go round and round in circles. And this is in the Pacific, uniquely shared between New Britain and Vanuatu, where it's very common and practiced to this day. And there's various other ethnographic things. In the Post et al. Article, they did attempt to bring up some linguistic patterns that could suggest that there was a sort of Papuan linguistic interference with the Austronesian transmission of Austronesian languages in Vanuatu. This may well be the case, but in a way, their examples were not so great because, as you can see on the map, for the island of New Britain, none of these features actually occur. So I'm not quite sure what that bit meant. Also, and I'm being rather brave in saying this, their emphasis was that although the genetic composition of the people changed, the language hadn't changed. And I don't think they have any evidence for that at all. Basically, you have a group of Oceanic Austronesian speakers, these East Asians coming out, speaking some version of Proto-Oceanic. Back in the Bismarcks, people who have been there for a long time are picking up this language, perhaps initially bilingual and then adopting the language. And so if a group of Papuans move into Vanuatu and essentially genetically and perhaps culturally take over from the East Asian group, there's no guarantee that they're speaking exactly this, that there's language continuity. They're both speaking early versions of some version of Proto-Oceanic. There's no necessity to argue that you've got language continuity and genetic change, major genetic change. Because as people have pointed out, this would be quite a rare event if it had happened. I don't see that we need to posit that at all. And indeed, if there is so much Papuan linguistic interference into Vanuatu languages, which appears to be the case, then surely it isn't the same language that the East Asian people were speaking. It's a partially it's an Austronesian language with a Papuan superstrate. So anyway, I think that in a way the linguists took over the genetic asylum in that case, and perhaps we need another thing. There was a lot of interest again in these papers, in Peter White's journal, Archaeology and Oceania, various discussions, and I just wanted to go over a couple of points that were raised because they are quite important points about ancient DNA. But looking at the time, I'm not sure when I started. Peter gave me a very fulsome introduction, went on for a long time. I won't go through them here. I think we covered them in our responses to the Archaeology and Oceania. I think that you have a fairly short period of time when you have this Papuan group coming along. So I said it's sort of really the end of Lapita, rather than the idea Post et al. Had that this was a sort of fairly long-term event, and I think we've got further evidence since. There was people who said, well, you've got a few of these skeletons, but there could be other people in Vanuatu who had considerable Papuan ancestry from the start of Lapita times. Well, we now have, it's not 11, it's 12 genomes from early Lapita genomes from 2 separate islands in Vanuatu, and we don't have any evidence of early admixed individuals. If they're there, we haven't found them. But also, and I think this is certainly persuasive to me, calculated from later admixed individuals, estimating the dates at which the original admixture occurred, all inferred dates point to admixture predominantly in post-Lapita times. Another suggestion that was made in relation to our early samples was that we only had 4 Lapita samples at the time. You can't say anything much. Now, it's true that more samples are always better. And we do lack samples between about 2,800 and 2,500, which is when we think that Papuan populations are arriving. But in some cases, a limited number of samples, even one, can shed a great deal of light. And just the fact that there are East Asian individuals in Lapita sites in Vanuatu 3,000 years ago, 2,900 years ago, straight away dispels the fact that the explanation for the current genetic mixture of people in Vanuatu is to do with some event that happened in the Bismarck archipelago. Straight away we can say, well, that can't be true because we've got people in Vanuatu who aren't admixed. And similarly, you only need one early Papuan sample, and now we have 3, I think, from Vanuatu, to know that if you've got people who basically are unadmixed Papuans from New Britain in the country 2,500, 2,300 years ago, then the admixture that we're talking about is taking place in the country and not back in the Bismarcks. So sometimes you don't need a lot of samples. Also, we're able to compare them with many hundreds of samples from both Vanuatu and from other parts of the Pacific, modern samples, and we can look at the genetic admixture as it happens. Now, this is a bit of a disaster. Yeah, well, if you did that, you could see it.
It doesn't do anything. And all
oh
the
dear,
IDs are gone at this time.
Oh dear.
I don't have any solution.
You don't have any solution because is the bulb blown or something? Is that what it must be? Don't they? Oh, okay.
Mention if you can write the Zoom number on the whiteboard over there.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I'm sorry about this, everyone. I will carry on as best as possible. 2018, 2 more important papers came out, which were the first ancient DNA samples that we had from islands Southeast Asia. And these helped fill in the picture, and they were also quite consonant with the results that we had, both published in Science, one from the David Reich's lab, Mark Lipson again, and one from Hugh McColl and others. And from 2019, and this is what I really wanted to show you, we started getting the first ancient DNA results from China. And what they basically show, there's a long, complicated history of the formation of populations in China. But for our purposes, we need to know there's basically in the Neolithic of China, there's a northern East Asian population, essentially the farmers around the the Yellow River, and there's a southern Eastern Asian population, which who are the farmers around the Yangtze Valley, who are the people who domesticated rice. And in these results from China, what I found particularly gratifying was that, of course, they compare their results from ancient DNA directly with the Teuma people. And what they were able to show was they're the same people as the southern East Asian Neolithic samples that they have. So that's when I say that, you know, at many removes, the people who colonized Vanuatu were East Asian rice farmers from the Yangtze Valley. In a general sense, that has been shown to be true by new ancient DNA results from China, which are pouring out at a great rate. The slide you can't see is a paper from 2019 that was published in Science by Melinda Yang and others. Vanuatu, in many of these, gets a Guernsey. If you look at all the diagrams inside, there's, you know, they've got their little, I'll try to describe it from here, a word picture. They've got their various lineages of populations, and Vanuatu's right in there coming off the Southern East Asian lineage. They do a lot of comparisons between Vanuatu and individual samples and populations within China. Also, another article has just came out in February the 22nd, under some new, you know, they're always trying to speed up getting papers out. So now there's a new thing called accelerated preview, which is great, except it says accelerated preview across all the nice figures that I wanted to show you. And again, Vanuatu gets a Guernsey in this paper, which is called Genomic Insights into the Formation of Human Populations in East Asia. So again, it's the same, basically it's the same story, that Vanuatu, early Lapita, links directly to southern Chinese Neolithic populations. And there was also a rather nice, but far too complicated to talk about, diagram that kind of went through back to very ancient populations of China. So we can really take the picture back 40,000 years or more. What has happened since in China is that essentially the expansion of the Han Chinese of northern China into southern China has largely wiped out the linguistic diversity that would have been there during the Neolithic. This is basically a movement of people within the last 2,000 years. So that's changed the story, and Chinese populations today are much more genetically homogeneous than they were during the Neolithic, when there were really two big movements. Also, another article that's just available is a preprint on ResearchGate by Huang et al. Tries to put together the ancient DNA, the language, and the archaeology, and comes up with some very interesting patterns, which do statistically seem to match the fact that you can look at basically the speakers of some particular language and see how they're moving around, tying into the genetics. Now, 2020, we had our third paper from the Wright Lab about Vanuatu, and this time we were looking much more at when Polynesian influence comes into Vanuatu in the last 700 years, and you get the establishment of Polynesian outlier populations, which are speaking Polynesian languages, living often on small offshore islands within Vanuatu. And we can see that their ancestry in Polynesia is coming from two different places, but we don't know which two different places. There kind of isn't enough information yet available to be able to tell us. And also, we had 4 new Teuma results. We had a new Papuan sample from Efate, a lot of good stuff. And the Chief Roy Mata Domain World Heritage Site, which is the burial of Chief Roy Mata and his followers in Vanuatu, Vanuatu's only World Heritage Site. We're also able to show that there are people in there who are very recently have descent from Polynesians. So they've mixed with the local Efate population at that time, about 400 years ago. Now, one question that always arises is, okay, you've got groups of East Asian Lapita using people in Vanuatu. Within a few hundred years, their genomes essentially have been radically altered, and people in Vanuatu today are, say, 70, 80, sometimes 90% of their genetic background is Papuan. Now, how did this major genetic turnaround happen? And the only thing that I can think of is that the Papuans are bringing in resistance to disease, which the East Asian populations, which have moved very quickly through East Asia to get out to places such as the Bismarck Archipelago and ultimately to Vanuatu, do not have resistance to disease. And malaria, I think, is the one. And it's certainly the case that the human leukocyte antigen genes, what we find very largely in the region and also into Polynesia, that these are Papuan derived. So I wonder if it's basically an adaptive change that is favoring the people with some key disease resistance, who are basically the Papuan populations coming from New Britain. Now, again, I've got a lovely graphic here, which you can't see. William Wilson is a linguist at University of Hilo in Hawaii. And his papers, starting in 1985 and most recently a paper in Journal of Polynesian Society of December of last year, are to me the most important papers in Polynesian linguistics for a generation at least. And what they show, and I think very convincingly, and also I would note that as of 2019, Bob Blust, the kind of senior Austronesian linguist anywhere, now agrees with Wilson that the origin of East Polynesian languages, and certainly the population as well, is not from Samoa, but derived fairly, well, completely directly from the central northern outliers, Polynesian outliers, off the east coast of the Solomon Islands, quite a long way off the east coast. And particularly I would note that the atoll of Ontong Java, or Luanua, is a very large atoll. Its lagoon is 100 kilometers long. Wilson, first of all, identified, I think he had like sort of 97 uniquely shared linguistic innovations that are shared between the North Central outliers and all East Polynesian languages, but are not found in Samoa. The number is now well over 200. And I think that I noticed not a single linguist has published anything that I've seen which argues against it. It's an open and shut case. People have always noted quite a difference in material culture between West and Eastern Polynesia. And the reason is this atoll filter, if you like, that we do find in the North Central outliers. And also at that latitude, there are currents that will take you pretty much straight from there directly to the Marquesas that are fairly constant currents. It is using the canoe technology that was available to people 1,000 years ago, about when Eastern Polynesia was settled. It isn't actually possible to sail from Samoa to the east. It's extremely difficult, let's put it that way. You know, maybe there was some real gung-ho super captain who could do it, but that's not how it happened. But getting there from the latitude of the Northern Solomons is a lot easier via the Phoenix Islands and places such as that. And I think this is a major change in our understanding of the relation between West and East Polynesia. And it's pretty hot stuff. And also, one thing that this William Wilson does, which is rather odd, is often his articles have rather strange titles. You think, well, that sounds a bit boring, I won't read that. But when you read them, they're actually about something quite different. And I would recommend, just for his subgrouping of Eastern Polynesian languages, his latest article, which is called something like Kaute, a wild hibiscus in Eastern Polynesia. which is the only place you can find his entirely new linguistic subgrouping of all the Eastern Polynesian languages, which transfers Hawaiian from being a Marquesan-related language to a Tahitian-related language. It's one of the things that happens there. Okay, there is also some whole genome work now being done in the Leeward Islands of Tahiti, so Eastern Polynesia, which again, there are some unique links in mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome lineages between Eastern Polynesia and Ontong Java, which are not shared with places in Western Polynesia. So again, some suggestion from the DNA that he's onto something. The remaining issues, the first one would be when and where did these Denisovans meet and mix and match with the Papuans? And when you read that article by Jacobs et al., if I'm reading it correctly, and I think I am, they're suggesting that some of the Denisovan 1 admixture, remember there's Denisovan 1 and Denisovan 2 are the two groups in the Eastern Indonesian Papuan region as people move in 50 to 60,000 years ago. The suggestion is that some of the admixture of Denisovan 1 with mainland New Guinea is occurring after the New Britain groups, the Beinings, in genetic terms have split off and become a separate population. Well, that happened 16,000 years ago. Now, if there were Denisovans giving their genes to people in New Guinea 16,000 or less years ago, where did that occur? It must have, we're talking about it occurred in New Guinea. So if there is anything in this article, and it's kind of mind-blowing, they are suggesting that an archaic hominid form is mixing with modern humans in New Guinea less than 16,000 years ago. Now, I don't know if I can believe, it's kind of mind-blowing. I don't know whether it's true or not. If it isn't true, then their genetic clocks are even worse than everybody else's genetic clocks. But we'll see. A second question would be, okay, we've got Papuan genes in Vanuatu by about 2,500 years ago. All Polynesians, all people in Fiji, all have 25% of their genome is derived from Papuan sources. When did this Papuan admixture occur in the rest of Polynesia? Well, it must have occurred before about 1,000 years ago, because that's when Eastern Polynesia is getting settled, and Eastern Polynesians also have admixture with Papuans. But when did it occur in Fiji? When did it occur in Tonga and Samoa? In looking at the evidence, which you can't see, I think it's got to be early. So I think that basically if you've got Papuans in Vanuatu by say 2,700, 2,500, next week you've got them in Fiji and you've got them in Tonga and Samoa the week after that. So I think that those genes get into the populations of Western Polynesia, I think, very quickly. Other people would say, oh, you can see evidence of contact between Fiji and Vanuatu or other places at various later times. That may well have happened as well, but I don't think we can explain the fact that all Polynesians are an admixed population without this having all taken place right at the start. My other question was, and I won't go into that one. You can't see it anyway. Another question, was there East Polynesian admixture with Native Americans? I think the answer is probably yes. Paper in Nature, July 2020, suggests that by looking at modern DNA today and comparing Polynesians and particular groups of coastal Native Americans, that they would suggest possibly a single contact between Native Americans of Colombia and looks like probably the Marquesas. And the kind of dating that they've got would suggest that basically you've got the settlement of Eastern Polynesia, people are spreading out very rapidly. 1,000 years ago, through to 700 years ago when they reached New Zealand. They didn't know that there were no more islands between the Marquesas and the Americas, and they just kept going. We've always known the sweet potato got into Eastern Polynesia, and with its Native American name, Kumala. So we've always had one line of evidence that there was some contact. And there is some genetic evidence, and they're able to argue why this is not a more recent contact, say with Chileans mixing with Rapa Nui, Easter Islanders. That happened in the colonial period. Many of those Chileans had Native American genes, mixed population. They're saying, no, this isn't that. And they can pick that up too. And it shows that there, the genes of admixed European Rapa Nui people, the Native American genes are Chilean. And when they start doing their genetic clocks, it's very recent. So that's that one. The last issue was, what about Micronesia? And I think probably, given how late it's getting, the best thing I could say is watch this space. I'm involved in a very exciting article which includes 21 ancient genomes from the Marianas, 3 from Ponape, and what's holding us up in publishing is that we're gathering together a whole bunch of modern DNA samples, and there's always been a question that linguists have argued a bit about, which is, what is the origin of the nuclear Micronesian people, which is most of the people of Micronesia, not the Marianas or Palau or Yap. And the suggestion has always been that they're coming, when you look at the linguistics, from somewhere between the Admiralty Islands down to north central Vanuatu. That is the origin of populations. There was nobody in Micronesia before then. What we're now able to show, or we will be able to show when the article is written, this is team Yue Chen Liu and others, again at the Wright Lab, we'll be able to show that the most likely route by which people are getting into much of Micronesia is via the Admiralty Islands. And that is because they are an admixed population between East Asians and Papuans, but their Papuan genes are not like the New Britain Papuan genes. As I said, we can distinguish Solomons, New Britain, New Ireland, mainland New Guinea. They fit best with it's either the Admiralty Islands or somewhere else along that northern fringe of New Guinea that is the source. Many years ago, the linguist Jackson suggested that nuclear Micronesian languages derived from the Admiralties. Bob Blust jumped on him from an enormous height and said, no, it's from the Cristobal Malayan subgroup in the Solomons. I think we should go back and look at what Jackson was saying. That's basically it, given that you can't see all these great points, but I did want to say something about Jack Golson, because had this lecture taken place when it was meant to take place, almost exactly a year ago on the 25th of March, it would have been the 60th anniversary of Jack's formal appointment to the ANU. So it's happening today. So we are on the eve of the 61st anniversary of Jack's appointment to the ANU. I think I first met Jack. He doesn't remember, and I couldn't find it in my notes. I think I first met Jack about 1975 in Cambridge. So I've known Jack for just slightly less than half of his life, and considerably less than or more than half of my life. Anyway, for a long time, I've known Jack. As Peter pointed out, Jack was my supervisor. He was my boss in the Department of Prehistory for many years. And I have to say, Jack, always a pleasure. You're a legend. So I think a hand for Jack. Thank you very much. Oh, I didn't tell you my conclusion. My conclusion is, no, we haven't solved all the problems yet, but we're a lot further along than we were before 2016. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Matthew. And always the consummate professional by continuing to give a rollicking lecture, you know, even when the technology didn't quite meet up to the standards we require. But I'm sure the 100 or so people online enjoyed the vision as much as anybody else, and I'm sure everybody here has a lot of questions. As is tradition with the Golson lecture, we don't follow on with a series of questions. We actually retire to the closest source of wine and juice and other beverages. So you can ask Matthew the questions there. So just finally, I'd like to again thank all the people who played a role in organising this. Some of them will be up the back helping you with the wine and so on. So everybody, yeah, please say thank you to them, and also really wonderful lecture. Thank you for such insights into the Pacific, always fascinating, and all the best with your future in Vanuatu, mostly. So yeah.